As our second speaker, I'll present to you Professor Giovanni Stanghellini. He's a medical doctor and a doctor honoris causa. He's a full professor of dynamic psychology at the Department of Health Science in the University of Florence. He is the leading editor of the Oxford Handbook of Phenomenological Psychopathology and co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Psychiatry. He has published more than 200 papers in the field of clinical phenomenology, and among his authored books, I'd like to mention Disembodied Spirits and the Animated Bodies, the Psychopathology of Common Sense, and Lost in Dialogue, Anthropology, Psychopathology, and Care. Professor Giovanni, it's nice to have you here with us. I give you the audience.
Thank you for this invitation. Thank you, Fabio, for this generous introduction. Guilherme showed the roots of clinical phenomenology, and we must be very grateful for that. Well, I will try to sketch what might be its future, especially if you are open to other languages. As mentioned by Guilherme, Matthew and I are running a project called Renewing Phenomenological Psychopathology, and my talk today is part of this project. Okay, there are two basic ways to discovery at play in psychopathology. I will call the first one ticking boxes, and the second drafting arrows. In ticking boxes, the main epistemological tenet is that psychopathological disorders manifest themselves in characteristic sets of symptoms that are in principle accessible to question and answer techniques. The clinician's main goal is discovering whether a patient meets pre-given diagnostic criteria. The aim of ticking boxes is neither an in-depth understanding of the patient's personal experiences, nor revealing previously unknown features of the patient's condition, but assessing those phenomena that are a priori deemed important as diagnostic indexes, leading to the classification of the patient according to predefined diagnostic categories. Diagnostic categories are often established in a politically driven manner rather than as a logical and scientific progression, via cooperative agreement and negotiations between experts, rather than according to the validity of nosographical categories, that is, on the basis of correspondence to external reality. The process of diagnosis in the clinic is compared to two people assembling a puzzle, where the patient has the pieces and the interviewer the image of the completed design. The interviewer's main goal is discovering whether a patient with a given set of symptoms, the single pieces of the puzzle, meets criteria, the image of the completed design. Ticking boxes seems to liken the clinician's task to that of an accountant counting symptoms, and accountabilism can be considered its epistemological hallmark. Actually, to a close look, ticking boxes does not imply discovery at all, if by discovery we mean the process of citing the existence of something for the first time. It has no heuristic power and ends up to be a mere tautology. A person with symptoms of depression is affected by a syndrome called depression. A second way to discovery is drafting arrows. That means constructing causal diagrams, directed graphs that display linear causal relationships between variables or nodes connected by an arrow to other nodes. Causal diagrams are explanatory narratives, including psychodynamic and biological ones. In psychodynamic explanatory diagrams, the aim is achieving meaningfulness via the logic of motivational causation. A given symptom is the consequence of a given mind state, usually an unconscious motivation, which typically involuntarily produces it. It is essential for a psychodynamic narrative to connect via an arrow a deeper mind state to a more surface or epiphenomenal one. Explanatory biological diagrams exploit the same logic, but in the place of psychological motivation, the cause to be linked by an arrow to a given surface symptoms is a deep biological anomaly. These forms of discovery based on linear causality and linear temporality have given great strength to psychopathological knowledge, but are not immune from limitations. They obviously imply some kind of reductionism of the complexities of human subjectivity. And although sweeping reductionism, a sort of theory of everything, seems to have disappeared from the scene, another no less problematic form of reductionism seems to be rampant. The second kind is creeping reductionism, which involves partial reductions that work on a patch of science where bit by bit we get fragmentary explanations using disparate interlevel mechanisms, including neurotransmitters, genes, neural circuits, etc. Creeping reductionism seems to tolerate a kind of pragmatic and pluralistic parallelism. How objective are the narratives construed through drafting errors? And how objective are the techniques devised to obtain reliable diagnosis through ticking boxes? Recognizing the value of objectivity in psychopathology and being faithful to it as much as possible is valuable, but being spellbound to the sirens of objectivity makes one lose sight of the very nature of the mental phenomena, which is relational and emergent. Although there is no single and neatly concept of emergence independent of particularly explanatory context, an emergent phenomenon can be roughly defined as a phenomenon that is irreducibly relational. Emergent features are not reducible to any intrinsic property of any element of a whole. Emergentism seems to be a corrective which counteracts the limitations of accountabilism, reductionism, and objectivism. Emergence occurs in the first place when an entity is observed to have properties that its parts separately do not have, properties that emerge only when the parts interact on a wider whole. An emergent phenomenon is a phenomenon that does not exist in itself, but needs an observer to take place. It emerges thanks to the interaction between something out there and the mind of an observer. Should we not give up some of our claims to reliability, linear causality, and objectivity? Should we not give up some of our claims to reliability, linear causality, and objectivity, and admit that discovery in psychopathology necessarily produces emergent knowledge? I will sketch an argument to support an alternative way to knowledge and discovery based on the emergent properties of psychopathological phenomena. I will call this approach linking dots. The dots at issue here are basically fragments of lived experience provided by the patients themselves as pieces of their personal history, experience situations, emotions, beliefs, imagination, dreams, etc. Or fragments of lived experience arising in the intersubjective space in between the patient and the clinician during the clinical encounter. I will refer to these fragments of lived experience or singular phenomena with the term images. The reason for choosing this word is that these images should be thought of as pictures to be hanged on a wall, ideally posited in front of the patient and of the clinician, and patiently collected before the links between them arise spontaneously or semi-spontaneously in the patient's and in the clinician's minds. I will develop the approach to images and discovery devised by art historian Aby Warburg in his Atlas of Images, Bilder Atlas Mnemosyne. Created in the late 20s, its final version, published in October 1929, consisted of 63 wooden panels covered with black cloth on which were pinned about 1,000 pictures from books, magazines, newspapers, and other daily life resources. This collection of images reminds of a very similar project started in the same period by German Jewish philosopher, cultural and literary critic Walter Benjamin, called Passagenwerk, translated into English, Arcades Project, an enormous collection of quotes from heterogeneous sources, as those used by Warburg, illustrating the city life of Paris in the mid-19th century. Let us briefly present the basic steps in Warburg's method and begin to establish a parallel with linking dots in clinical practice. The first step consists of the establishment of an archive or collection of images gathered during the process of discovery in the clinical context, the psychopathological interview. A network of resonating images thus emerges. We may call this figura. A figura is a web of images reverberating with each other that is established thanks to linking dots between the individual images. Within a figura, each image constitutes a nucleus for the discernment of other images that relate to it. First, each image of the archive resonates with the others. Second, the images resonate with the observer's gaze. And then building on such a semi-spontaneous formed network of images, the further steps consist of an active montage of resonant images. The images are not mounted on the basis of inductive or deductive operations, but by their exemplary or paradigmatic characteristics. The juxtapositions are not even based on a diachronic temporal logic, but the elements of this archive are collected without regard to the linear model of temporality. The connection between such images is analogical, that is based on similarity, on family resemblances. And analogy is suspended within an emotional logic and the formal logic, as in the intention between these. The figurative links semi-spontaneously emerged via resonance and actively established via montage, uncover what in Walter Benjamin's words we may call their optical unconscious. These are steps of this process, but the process itself is never completed. These networks of images form an open construction, not a closed one like a diagnostic category or like the teleology of certain narratives. They provide a space for thought. This network constitutes a space for discovery, for the birth of a new thought. This practice could be taken as an exemplary method of discovery to be applied in the field of psychopathology, where the phenomena at issue are pathic and relational in nature. I suggest that Warburg's is an illustration of linking dots, an alternative or an integrative method to other methods like ticking boxes and drafting errors. In the concluding of my talk, I would like to summarize the epistemological principles of this way to discovery. First, linking dots proposes to shift attention from symptoms conceived as objective facts out there, conceptually described, to non-schematized affective qualities arising in a relational space condensed in images. Second, it also recommends to move away from computational and narrative connections between phenomena to analogical figurative links between them within a network of analogies constituting a space for discovery. Third, and last but not least, it advises to focus, rather than on linear causality, on circular relationships and on the emergence of figurative causes generated by the interaction between the parts of a whole and between these parts and the observer. Whereas in the logic of ticking boxes, the particular, that is, the symptom, represents a regularity by identifying which the patient's individual case can be traced back to a general diagnostic category. In the logic of linking dots, the particular, a fragment of lived experience, a single image, does not have its own intrinsic meaning, for instance, as a diagnostic index that refers to the general, but instead represents an exception, a singularity that arouses perplexity and disrupts the previously acquired representation of the patient's condition to the point of threatening the stability of the diagnostic categories. The objective of gathering images in the logic of linking dots is not to decipher a hieroglyphic, but to produce a hieroglyphic, a thought-provoking hieroglyphic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you,